Section 8 for financing. This is where they've made the most changes. We're going to spend the most amount of time on this section. So Section 8A is for cash. Previously, this section had about 3 or 4 more lines on here that talked about the CFPB requirements. If buyer was getting financing, there's no financing contingency. They've shortened this to just say this is a cash transaction with no financing contingency. The Florida Realtors explanation for this is simply that they've simplified this section because the reference to the lender requirements was not necessary. So this change doesn't actually change anything. It's just shortening the language. If a buyer is submitting a cash offer, they can still get financing. They just don't have a financing contingency. So whether they're going to get a private loan or a loan with a regular mortgage lender, if the cash box is checked, they have no financing contingency and they have to close. Section 8A doesn't allow for CFPB requirements. So what we just talked about with Section 5, the TRID clause, if the buyer's going to get a loan on a cash transaction, they just don't have any of the protections that the financing contingency would normally afford them. And with the changes that they've made to Section 8B, this is going to become super important. In 8B, they've added number 1 here and number 2. So they've split the loan approval period into 2 requirements. The first requirement is that the buyer do everything that they need to do in order to get a loan, 30-day loan approval period. They have to apply for a mortgage loan application at a certain rate and a certain term of years, and that is defined as financing. The second part of the loan approval period, which is new, is the appraisal. So if the lender requires an appraisal as a condition of loan approval, then the appraisal now has to be done within the loan approval period in order for the buyer to get loan approval per the contract. So if your lender is sending out loan approval and one of the conditions on that is an appraisal, then the buyer does not have loan approval per this contract. If the buyer goes past the loan approval period, whether it's 10, 15, 20, 30 days, if they go past that and they do not have an appraisal, and that's one of the conditions, then they do not have loan approval. So when you give notice to the seller that you have loan approval, if one of the conditions is an appraisal, then you don't have loan approval. That is the major change that they're making to this section. We've all dealt with appraisals that are taking an extremely long time to happen now. And in the old contract, appraisals used to be an exception. So you could get loan approval, and if one of the conditions was a satisfactory appraisal and it appraised low and the buyer lost their loan approval, then the buyer could terminate the contract. Now, the appraisal has to be done during the loan approval period. If you have an appraisal contingency, that will still apply. And if it appraises low, the buyer will be able to terminate the contract. However, if the appraisal is not done during the loan approval period, the only protection you'll have is that appraisal contingency, unless you waive the loan approval period. And we'll get into that a little bit later. We're going to go through each of the changes in Section B, and it's going to culminate with what the new requirements for buyers, agents, and buyers are because of all of these changes in this section. How are you going to have to submit offers now? We have lenders that are able to give loan approval very quickly, but they can't promise that the appraisal is going to get done within that quick loan approval period. So now we're going to start to see under this contract longer loan approval periods, probably. If appraisals are taking 3 weeks, then are we going to see 30-day loan approval periods again? Possibly, yeah. From the buyer side, you need to have a serious conversation with the lender to figure out when is that appraisal going to be done, because the way this contract is written, we need the appraisal in order to get loan approval. And if the lender's saying, yeah, we can get it in 2 weeks, okay, great, you're going to rush it. But if you don't get it in 2 weeks, now you're going to have a decision to make as to whether or not the buyer has to back out of the contract because we don't have an appraisal. Or do we have to add an appraisal contingency in? Will the seller agree to that?